Hello and welcome to EDH Rec's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average decklist as compiled by the data on EDH Rec and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This week's commander absolutely proves that if you like it, you should put a ping on it. Ghyrson Starn Kelermorph is the standout commander from the Warhammer precons. 3 mana, 3/2, ward 2, and whenever one of our sources deals exactly 1 damage to something, Ghyrson will follow it up with an additional 2 damage, turning all our pings into lightning bolts. Starn was just a secondary commander in one of the 3-color precons, but he's pulled a similar move to Yuriko the Tiger Shadow and has already overtaken the other legends from the set as the #1 most popular Warhammer commander. Starn unlocks a whole niche of pinger cards to build around in Commander, giving us exciting new space to explore. Let's see what he's up to by grabbing his average deck list from the average deck feature and importing it to the Archidect deck building website. As always, any swaps made to the list must either keep the total price cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. Ah, the Prodigal Son returns. Or, in this case, the Prodigal Sorcerer. Ghyrson Starn's deck has become a huge haven for Tim cards, the nickname for 3-mana creatures that can tap to deal 1 damage to something. Of course, there's more than just, quote, pinger tribal going on in this deck, but we'll get to that in a moment. The other immediate impression that I want to mention is the extremely low land count here. 33 lands is well under the usual rate that I'd be comfortable with, so this deck had better have a good reason for playing 33 lands. And luckily, it does. This deck's mana curve is very low, only about an average mana cost of 2.3, while lots of other decks have an average mana cost of like 3.2. Too many lands would flood this deck out, so we'll have to pay very special attention to how that affects our card evaluation and our upgrades. Before we begin, let's examine Starn's signature and core cards. Obviously, we've already met the pingers. In my opinion, the most important pingers present are the ones that can damage any target, and especially those that have special untap clauses that allow us to use their effects multiple times a turn. Starn also loves him some very important enhancements. Giving the damage lifelink or death touch can really rack up the death count while bolstering our own life total beyond the reach of our enemies. And Sigil of Sleep and Curiosity effects are huge. These don't just trigger off of combat damage, they trigger off of any damage. This is where Starn can really get out of control, drawing bazillions of cards off every follow-up shock he dishes out. And where Curiosity lingers, Niv-Mizzets are rarely far behind. These dragons are the most expensive cards to cast in the entire deck, the top end that can combo out pretty dang easily, drawing the whole deck and, with Ghyrson's help, dealing 3 damage per card drawn, utterly destroying life totals. Then, of course, there are some innocuous-looking cards that Ghyrson turns into powerhouses. 1 damage to all our enemies and their creatures? Good luck, token players! Small commanders don't stand a chance at staying in play, and following up with a poke from one of our pingers or one of our extra spells is usually enough for Starn to pick off even the huge dragons flying around in the format. Even better, a lot of these extra spells are cantrips that replace themselves, and therefore can keep our train chugging. Even if we can't keep a pinger creature in play, a few of these effects like Caltrops and Circle of Flame will make it extremely hard for any creature to attack us at all. Combined with a few Punisher effects, Starn can make even the very land upon which we stand a lethal proposition. And when it's time to close it all down, a few well-timed key spells will unload a final barrage to obliterate our enemies' hopes and dreams. Flame Fusillade in particular just makes me so happy to see. I've been trying to make this card work since the original Ravnica, and I'm just so delighted that it's found such a perfect home at last. Okay, now that we've got our bearings, let's get started on the upgrades. Normally, I like to have multiple sections for different types of upgrades, but this is Ghyrson Starn we're talking about, so we'll have exactly 1 section. And then he can tack on some bonus high budget and low budget honorable mentions at the end. Let's get to it. I don't have a lot of changes to make to this deck list. I really like the synergies here, and I really like what this deck is up to. If I were to put any asterisk onto that, I would probably note that I do have a small concern about whether or not this deck is trying to do 2 different things at once, but we can address that later. For now, let's just talk about a couple of quick upgrades that will get us going. When I first went through the deck, I loaded up a huge list of other tappy pingers the deck wasn't yet playing, in the hopes that I'd get to stuff them into the deck list somewhere. However, I quickly learned that there's a hierarchy of pingers for this deck, and only some can actually make the cut. S-tier pingers are the ones that untap themselves. These can really control a board and dish out tons of damage to both creatures and to players. A-tier are the versatile pingers. These can hit any target, and I didn't fully appreciate what a big deal that was at first. Basically, these can help control the board. Hitting any creature at any time, or defaulting to ping a player if nothing else comes up, is very important to keep ourselves alive, because enemies will be gunning for us. However, we can't rely just on these, because up next is B-tier, the life melters. These are crucial to the strategy, make no mistake. We need cards like these if we're going to take down all of our enemies. When combined with Starn, these behave like OG Perforos, utterly demolishing life totals in quick fashion. We need a mix of both A and B, because the A tiers can swap between hitting opponents or creatures to help keep nasty stuff off our back and keep us alive, while the B tiers will help actually close the game down faster than any of our other cards, and limit the amount of time our opponents have to actually find something that will scupper our strategy. And if you're curious, I would say that the C tier pingers are the ones that can only hit non-player targets or only hit one player, which is why you don't see them in this deck list. I'd wondered about adding some of these to the deck when I first loaded up the list, but once I got to know how the deck works, I realized that these were basically unnecessary. Starn's other spells already do such a good job of controlling the board that these limited pingers were just not a necessary addition. When you need all these different categories, card draw, acceleration, interaction, removal, as well as S, A, and B tier pingers to make the strategy work in the first place, you just don't have room left over for the C tier list. So, all of that is to help explain the cuts I'm about to make. I think that these are also secretly C-tier pingers. First, this here Spear Spewer that appears in the list is not my favorite. Our other life melters are way more repeatable, and this one also hits us, not just our enemies. Get on out of here. Next, I have it out for the Defiler. 4 mana already makes it one of the most expensive cards in the deck, and I'm really not kidding about that. Its ability helps us save on mana, but it's kind of meh for us, and the ping effect itself is sorcery speed only. I'm way not into it. Sorry, Phyrexia. And lastly, though some folks may disagree about this one, I'm not in love with the Roiling Vortex either. It does a fine job of being a life melter, but it's slow, I guess. All our other life melters are repeatable in a way that I find more reliable. And it's very possible that this one is a meta call. I just didn't feel like I needed it, and the punishment effect on free spells wasn't relevant for me, but I totally understand if others feel differently. I just felt like these pinger cards I've cut out didn't deliver like the other cards in the deck do, and that this deck really needed help with something else. And what does it need help with? Simple. More card advantage. This strategy can really run out of cards in hand fast. If you can make the Curiosity synergy happen for this deck, then great, you'll be splendid. But if you can't get one of those powerful combinations lined up, then you might get stuck top decking and be a sitting duck all game. So a few more cards to grease the wheels will go a long way. I honestly wanted to get something like a Windfall into the deck, but that's like a $5 card right now, so it would actually be out of budget. Instead, I'll opt for some kind of funny cards. First is Light Up the Stage. It's not a draw spell, but this impulse draw will basically always cost 1 mana for this deck, because we're pinging life totals all the dang time. 1 mana to dig 2 cards down? That's an excellent rate. And next, well, Windfall was out, but what about Midnight Clock? We discussed this one on a recent EDH Recast episode, and it's really been impressing me lately. Again, I wish I could just play a Windfall instead, but this card here is only like 50 cents, and drawing 7 new cards after just a couple turns is just plain good. When you're stuck with no cards in hand, this is the exact kind of effect that you want. And this might sound weird, but it's also important to me that this card makes colored mana. Like, quick tangent, but did you notice that there's a Felwar Stone in this deck? And an Exotic Orchard? In most other 2-color decks, I wouldn't think that we need these all that much because they're not reliable color fixers, but I actually like them for Starn. Take a careful look at the pips in this deck. We have a lot of cards that cost some very specific mana costs. So mana rocks that produce colorless mana are actually kind of risky because they might not actually help us cast multiple spells in one turn if our spells are this pip focused. One of the only colorless rocks that we have in the deck is Mindstone, which can help us draw a card because we're probably going to need extra card draw later on in the game. But yeah, the color mana thing is just a fun tidbit that I thought was important to point out. Spellslinger decks with a low mana curve view colorless mana as a significant issue. So that's why I like the Felwar Stone here, even though this is a 2-color deck, and why I think Midnight Clock, which can make blue mana and has the potential to gas us back into a game if things have stalled out, have a pretty good benefit for us, even if we're usually more accustomed to a lot of other colorless producing 2-mana rocks that are out there. Alright, with that done, the last thing I gotta add is an old fave of mine, Nurok's Stealth Suit. Look, I'm glad Starn has Ward 2. That is a good chunk of protection. And to be honest, I hope Wizards of the Coast kicks the habit of putting Ward 2 on powerful legends like this, because I think that could be a dangerous precedent. But Starn draws a lot of attention, and frankly, I think he needs even more protection if he's gonna stay alive. This is a burn-style deck that routinely kills tons of creatures on the board, and even uses some Punisher effects to keep opponents off of their mana, and it entirely relies upon its commander for the deck to do anything. That is a recipe for archenemy status if I've ever heard one. We need to keep Starn alive at all costs, and this is one of the cheapest and most reliable ways to keep our valuable ping strategy online. Alright, before we go, I'm gonna make a fuss about one last card in the mana base, and it's actually a classic. But hey, Shivan Reef, I have a bone to pick with you, buddy. You deal 1 damage to us. Ghyrson Starn doesn't just affect damage dealt to our opponents and to their stuff, it cares about damage to anything. That means this land will deal 3 damage to us if we want to make a red or a blue. No thank you! Like, yes, if Starn has lifelink, then this doesn't matter, but there's only 1 lifelink granting card in the deck right now, and if Sigil of Sleep is on our commander, then we're really shooting ourselves in the foot, so yeah, let's just avoid it altogether. I'ma just swap this out for a basic. 1 colored mana isn't worth 3 damage. And that will be it for swaps. Exactly 1 section, just like Starn likes it. But now it's time for his bonus follow-ups. Let's talk honorable mentions. First of all, this deck has tons of places to go if you want to get more lavish. More lifelink, more advanced spells, and I especially recommend getting bigger and better draw effects that have a supremely low mana investment. This deck is low to the ground, so it depletes on cards in hand very fast. But it also can't afford like 7 mana spells to refill the hand, so plan accordingly. There's also the matter of combo. If you want to dedicate this deck to a Niv Mizzet Curiosity spectacular showdown with Starn making sure that it's lethal-tastic, then tutors or fast mana and other such friends will likely lie in your future. And I'll mention too that if you want to get a little infecty to make Starn's damage even more life-melty, then that's a spicy avenue to explore as well. Though that one doesn't always have to be expensive. Some budget cards like Corrupted Conscience can make that happen for super cheap as well. And speaking of which, let's now get to the inverse. What if you're a little tighter on the budget? Well, here's a fun fact. You can lop off about $65 from the cost of the entire deck here if you just slice out these 3 cards. And if you chop out these 3 lands on top of it, then you're saving about $100 total. Just these 6 cards equal half the cost of the entire deck list. You could easily make this deck under $100 without breaking a sweat. And so, for upgrades and alternatives when working on that type of budget build, I'd say to examine the list further and really consider which path you want to take. I hinted at this at the beginning of the video, but let's examine it more now. This deck is kinda trying to do 2 things at once. It's simultaneously all about pingers, and it's got a lot of Spellslinger payoffs. Speaking just for myself, if I built my own Ghyrson Starn deck, I'd personally forego the spellslinging and focus 100% on more ping tribal effects. And when you're upgrading, especially if you're on a budget, that might be a different direction that you would prefer to travel down. Plus, you can play around more with the mana curve that way too. There are a lot of cool cards out there that are 4 or 5 or 6 mana that couldn't make the considerations for this upping the average and the upgrades because of how low the overall entire mana curve of the deck is and how slim that land count is. But if you're in an all-ping tribal deck without spell storm stuff, that might have a different expectation of the mana curve and mana resources. So favorite cards like Willbreaker would be right at home there. And that could completely change your own expectations and endgame plans for the entire strategy. Or by contrast, if you don't like the pinger direction, you can free up tons of slots by removing them and crafting a more dedicated Storm-style deck list. The deck already had Grapeshot, but it can go from one of the role players and potential finishers to being the role player, the finisher. I think this current list managed to fuse both of these styles together pretty nicely, but if you prefer one of these directions over the other, just keep an eye out on what you like most about this commander. But also, one last thing, like, Ghyrson Starn is way more versatile than just those 2 routes. Remember, he doesn't only affect non-combat damage sources. Like, if you have a bunch of 1/1s, Ghyrson will tack on a bunch of damage to them too. So you could make a Goblin tribal deck, or a bunch of Thopters or Mir, or tons of other options. And all of those 1/1s will also make Starn deal out a bunch of extra shock damage. Get out your lab goggles and tinker around with this strategy. No matter what you do, Starn is going to make it explosive. Alright, that will do it. Here we have Ghyrson Starn's new deck list. You can find a link to it down in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope this has helped you get a fearsome start with Ghyrson Starn, and if you have any other recommendations that you'd like to make for your fellow Ping players, make sure you leave your suggestions down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.